Time now for today's perspective. Hybrid humans, tall forests and active volcanoes. That's the picture painted in the book, Europe, the first 100 million years, which tells us about the first time that apes stood on their own 2 feet. They were actually in Greece, how the real beginning of the European story came in the form of a toad, more or less. Well, the book's author, paleontologist and environmentalist Tim Flannery joins us now to tell us more. Mr. Flannery, your book has just been translated into French. In French, it's called Le Supercontinent. Reading this book, I mean, it's so hard to know where to start in this massive, massive history, but you start really with the appearance of the first European organism.
That's right. We have to start somewhere, and that is the logical place. It's the moment when a distinctive European entity first appears on our planet. And that moment's about 90 to 100 million years ago, and that first entity is a toad.
Indeed. Is it the midwife toad still like that we can still see in Europe today?
That's correct. It's the ancestor of that toad. And I should point out that those toads are such primitive amphibians that in Australia we have nothing like them. I mean, we're proud of having the platypus and other primitive mammals, but our amphibians are much more recent. So Europe is very special.
And indeed, give us an idea of how that evolved, because it was because of the way the Europe was a series of islands, that's how the animals kind of
Well,
evolved.
that's right. Yeah, look, Europe is the only continent that formed as an island archipelago. All the rest of the continents formed from a breakup of bigger land masses. But Europe was at the crossroads of the three biggest land masses on our planet: Asia, Africa and North America. And this island archipelago acted as a sort of a gateway or bridge, letting animals go from one continent to the other and flow through Europe. So it became this centre of very rapid evolution.
It's fascinating, and one of the things that really got my attention are when you speak about these hybrid humans. I mean, the Neanderthals of Europe that roamed and evolved quite dramatically over the years, and we're here until very recently.
Well, that's right. They were here for 800,000 years. So we modern people are much more recent. I guess our story started 38,000 years ago when African people, who would have looked just like Africans today, arrived in what is now Romania and hybridised with those Neanderthals. And those Neanderthals were probably red-haired, pale skin, large blue eyes, and some of their genes have survived with us today. So we are really a hybrid.
We still have a percentage Neanderthal in our makeup.
Sadly small, only 2%. But in the past, it was perhaps 10%.
Fascinating. And these Neanderthals, they're credited with creating domesticity.
Well, that's right. Those very first hybrids seem to have been the first people to domesticate any animal, and that animal was the dog. So we have early evidence of domestication from Belgium 36,000 years ago. And they were also the people that made all the beautiful cave art. There was very little before that, but as soon as these hybrids are created, they draw this beautiful art, fully formed. And some of their early carvings are of hybrid beings. There's a wonderful lion-human hybrid being found in a cave in Germany that speaks to me so eloquently of what was in the minds of those early hybrids.
Indeed, a wonderful imagination and creativity that we can still see, of course, and relate to. Also, we look at, earlier on in your book, you talk about the fossils, the treasure troves of fossils that can be found, notably in one particular location in Germany, in Europe, but also you warn about fake fossils. There's a market for them, apparently.
Well, there is indeed, especially from this place called Messel, and where the fossils, you don't need much imagination to examine them because they're preserved so perfectly. The skin's preserved, the fur, even females with the fetus inside the body still, or the last meal. They're magnificent fossils. But this site, yes, there's been a number of fakes produced where people have found half of a fossil and then stuck the half of another one on the back to make it look like a full example, but in fact it isn't.
Yeah, and they've often even fooled experts on the issue. Absolutely. So, I mean, we have to be aware of that. Fakes are everywhere in life. One reassuring thing, perhaps, in your book is that you say that wildlife in Europe is making a comeback.
It really is. Europe was the place that almost lost its wildlife up about the time of the Second World War. There were people everywhere and very little wildlife. But you look at Europe today and the return of wolves, the bewolfing of Germany, as people talk about, and the bears now coming back. So we're seeing a return of wildlife as people leave those most difficult areas, the highest valleys or the most remote villages, and move into the city. And it's creating space for wildlife in Europe again. And I think, 100 years from now, Europe may be the place which does have space for elephants and lions, because there won't be any space in Africa. Africa will have 4 billion people.
And maybe space, once again, for apes. And you mentioned in your book that the first time the ape walked on its own 2 feet, it was actually in Greece. How did you explain that to us? How did you find that out?
It was so astonishing to me, to discover that, yes, the very first upright ape, our first ancestor, lived in Greece about 7 million years ago and coexisted with these gigantic apes that appear to have been the ancestors of the gorillas. And the most astonishing thing, on the island of Crete, people have found footprints left by these little bipedal apes. The footprints are only that long, small apes, but they were wandering about in a shallow sea 6 million years ago, and we still have their footprints. It's so beautiful.
And those are the footprints that gave the clue that it all began there.
Yes, absolutely, along with the bones that we have from Greece. But those apes must have walked from Europe into Africa. They become extinct in Europe and then return back to Europe from Africa millions of years later.
A fascinating study, and of course our environment, and you've studied it for many, many years, and even discovering a number of new species of mammals, tree kangaroos, I remember. You are Australian though, and we're seeing the current climate change talks going on in Madrid. We're constantly told the time to act is now, but is it too late? Is there still time to turn things around?
No, it's not too late. I guess it's never too late, because things can always get worse. But what we must face now is that we have inflicted serious damage on our children's future, and that if we want to minimise that damage, this is the moment to act. And it's unconscionable to continue as we are, because you think, I don't know whether you have children, but I do, and I don't want them inheriting a world that's falling apart.
But how do you think that action can help? But I mean, people are saying the governments obviously need to step in, but as individuals, is there anything? It's so overwhelming.
Yeah, look, we do what we can as individuals, and showing leadership is very important. But what really needs to change is government and industry. So we need a rapid transition to a cleaner, greener and cheaper and more prosperous economy. We can have that, but we have to move the fossil fuel interests out of the way if we're to achieve that.
Indeed. Mr. Tim Flannery, thanks so much for coming in and telling us a bit more about our fascinating history and giving us some hope for the future.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Tim Flannery, whose book Le Supercontinent is just out in French, and if you're looking for it in English, it's called Europe, the First 100 Million Years, just that. Okay, now if you're just joining us, these are our top stories. A more united front expected to be presented by the leaders of NATO's nations. They're turning their attention to the common approach to China and recommitting to defending each other. But as they gathered in London, divisions among the member states were blatantly clear. They clashed on spending and overall strategy. A 300-page report that says the US president put his personal interests before that of the country lays out the case for impeachment of Donald Trump. US Democrats have handed their evidence over to the Judiciary Committee, which has the power to draft impeachment articles.